Most of what occurs in the practice of science goes on behind closed doors, beyond the prying eye of the public. Nevertheless, science and the scientists who conduct its research seem to enjoy an almost religious-like reverence, having been granted a virtual hands-off policy by the public at large to create, advance, and mold the future. Against this backdrop, however, science is increasingly accused of fraud in the pursuit of useful research findings, applications, and profits.
There's corruption in any field. I mean, there are great people and there are people that are somewhat corrupt in any field. Science is no different. There are all kinds of people that go into science and they are corruptible.
Virtually all of the science that is practiced in the United States is honest and well-intentioned. Does fraud occasionally happen? Yes, it occasionally happens.
While there are more than 1 million active scientists in the United States whose activities contribute greatly to our prosperity and on whose integrity we rely, critics argue that science is fairly frequently done as fast practice. That scientists, like the rest of us, try to cut corners, get their papers published, have their ideas for research funded, compete with co-professionals, and vie for glory.
I could spend an entire day telling you about the science and research fraud that my colleagues and I know about.
It is alleged by many that science fraud is commonplace in a society driven by money and ambition. To be sure, science is not a career for the faint of heart. On the contrary, science is an aggressive, ruthless business. Still, the practitioners and institutions of science are accused of going beyond mere ambition in the eternal quest for knowledge. Are researchers, pressured by the need to produce, venturing beyond the boundaries of honest science into the forbidden territory of science fraud? Despite this revered social standing, scientists are now, more than ever, motivated toward the falsification of research in pursuit of hefty corporate grants or public recognition. The scientific process has changed greatly over the years. For the scientist, the pressure of obtaining funding, which often is tied to professional advancement, is felt both internally from the employer and externally from the grant-giving bodies.
There is enormous pressure on scientists to obtain grant funding. It is very demanding. The process is nerve-wracking for scientists.
I think it's a trend in society that money is just much more important now. I think the trouble is funds are limited, and that's just a fact of life, and scientists have to compete for money.
Modern science is a large-scale enterprise, heavily funded and highly directed. Its dominant players are large corporations and the U.S. government, both of whom have definite stakes in the outcome of any given research. In the mainstream media of today, tales of science fraud abound.
Sometimes the money is set aside solely for universities, sometimes it's set aside solely for business, sometimes solely for government laboratories, sometimes anybody can go after it. And so we write proposals to government agencies. We're usually in competition with all these other organizations.
Further complicating these financial challenges, seasoned scientists find themselves competing for finite funds in a glutted field, going up against much younger, comparatively inexperienced practitioners. This competition for grants, status, position, and money makes the temptation to veer away from the straight and narrow almost irresistible.
So the individual who is able to attract grant funding, and particularly grant funding repetitively, is viewed as being someone who is desirable to retain on one's faculty and certainly to promote.
Anytime a company like Pfizer funds a researcher, there is usually a contracting that goes on between the two as to where the restrictions are, what the specific outcomes are. Is there an expected outcome for the investment? Yes, there would be.
With such outrageous amounts of money at stake, grant recipients are subjected to such massive scrutiny by their patrons that the possibility for failure can barely be entertained.
Because university scientists are very independent and very rigorous in their approach to science, and quite frankly, are not as profit-driven, and therefore basically will analyze data in an appropriate manner, and they will not be biased just because they have a certain amount of grant support from a pharmaceutical firm.
The industry being involved in university research is a double-edged sword. There is the fear that there will be some interjection of their agenda into the research.
Are they somewhat restricted in that they can't say they're going to do research on ABC and then decide to do research on XYZ without the involvement and the approval of the person funding it? Sure, they shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Given such an environment, does the potential for objective scientific research even exist? What incentive is there for a scientist to research a lackluster group of findings if these will only result in his being passed over the next time deep-pocketed corporations come courting? It should come as no surprise, then, that many scientific researchers are becoming less concerned about whether data is contaminated and more concerned about what can be done with contaminated data.
Because if there's anywhere that science could be more corrupt, it would be within the company itself, because those scientists are really profit motivated. And there are very sad stories where people fudge a little piece of data and their careers are destroyed.
Despite these consequences, the lure of short-term gain through fudged research is undeniable, and once indulged, becomes science fraud. By definition, scientific fraud is the deliberate act of a scientist or group of scientists to knowingly pass faulty or misleading data to peers or the public. Examples of fraud include forged or fabricated data, falsified results, plagiarism, piracy, and other premeditated acts intended to mislead or deceive.
Some of the most classical cases that I can think of, first was a psychiatrist from Arcadia, California, who falsely claimed that a drug, THA, was a treatment for Alzheimer's, and subsequently that created a tremendous demand for this drug. But he was busted by one of my colleagues at the FDA, Francis Kelsey, who forced him to retract his results.
In addition, 4 pharmaceutical companies seeking commercial gain are caught making payments to a top government researcher to secure his assistance in accessing confidential research he is conducting at the National Institutes of Health. Without batting an eye, one group of industry scientists stand behind their conclusive research that cigarette smoking is in no way harmful to human health. And the list goes on.
There was a junior researcher at the Harvard Medical School who published 18 major articles and 100 abstracts, most of which were completely bogus. He was flushed out by another colleague of mine from the National Institutes of Health, Walter Stewart, Stewart was also caught a professor at the University of California at San Diego who was writing papers at a rate of 1 every 10 days, and they were all based on complete fabrications. He was forced to withdraw and retract 15 of these papers. Unfortunately, the field of science is strewn with cases like this.
In an age of billion-dollar atom smashers and multi-million-dollar magnetic resonance imaging machines, research is more complex and costs continue to soar. The largest grant-giving bodies simply cannot meet the demand for new research requests. Vying for finite funds from the backers of modern research is a huge pool of both seasoned and unseasoned scientists. The competition is enormous. Competition for grants, status, position, and money. It can be accurately said then that the scientist's very livelihood depends on appealing to deep pockets to obtain grants, to whom it is alleged the scientist will then be subjected to massive oversight on the part of the powerful vested interests.
And the difficulty, I think, is that business people have very different motivations from scientists. And in the end, money makes the communication between the two very difficult. The business people are interested in, the bottom line. How can they make the company most profitable? Whereas the research scientists are interested in developing a neat technology, a new product. How can this technology help cure diseases and things? So there's a great barrier to having the two mesh.
The whole reason why agencies like the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Food and Drug Administration, and many others have reviewers to scrutinize the work done by researchers is because of the extreme dangers to the public of faulty research. I'm aware of a number of faulty drug studies that were contaminated and biased either deliberately or unintentionally, testing certain drugs on patients with a variety of ailments that ended up as articles in medical journals only to have been retracted later. If an innocent doctor had read any of these articles, they may well have prescribed that drug to a patient and ended up making things much worse.
Medical research and the development of new physical and drug therapies are specialty areas of scientific study wherein human lives may often hang in the balance. Because the financial gains available to pharmaceutical companies can be so enormous, experts contend that the tendency toward conflict of interest is markedly increased. Such has certainly been the case in the area of AIDS research. Probably the most infamous case of science fraud involved Piltdown Man and the discoveries that occurred between 1912 and 1915, when Charles Dawson, a lawyer and amateur geologist, announced that he had found what appeared to be the partly ape-like skull of an ancient human in a gravel bed on Piltdown Common near Lewes, England. It was touted as a long-sought evolutionary missing link between apes and humans. Piltdown was a significant find for the British, for up to that point they could not lay claim to a major archaeological discovery of their own. At last, the Piltdown skull was theirs. Meanwhile, not long after the Piltdown discovery, one Raymond Dart found another human fossil in Africa. This find, however, gave rise to a serious problem. To accept Dart's discovery discredited Piltdown, and to accept Piltdown discredited Dart. It wasn't until 1953, almost 40 years later, that a chemical analysis of the remains showed beyond a reasonable doubt that the scientific establishment had been duped for 4 decades by the Piltdown hoax. The cranium belonged to a modern human, and the jaw belonged to an orangutan. Both had been skillfully stained and altered to look old. Critics point to plenty of modern-day examples of so-called suspect science as well, such as cold fusion. And pharmaceutical companies have, more than once, had to recall products that were promoted along during the scientific process, approved by the FDA and beloved by the public, such as in the case of the weight loss drug Fen-Phen. Although the frequency of this kind of behavior has increased in recent years, science fraud is not a new problem. In fact, some of the biggest names in history have pulled off some of the biggest scams. It is widely known in the scientific community that Isaac Newton, father of modern physics, intentionally skewed data to make the work of a rival appear less important. Since his competitor's philosophy clashed with his own theory of universal gravitation, Newton improved some of his calculations on the velocity of sound and precision of the equinoxes to overshadow and malign the work of his challenger. Also guilty of fudging data is the 19th century monk Abbé Gregor Mendel, founder of the modern gene theory through the breeding and crossbreeding of pea plants. His results were so suspiciously perfect that they prompted later investigation. The reviews of Mendel's work now indicate that the revered scientist tailored his data to help justify his new theories. One modern-day example of scientific discovery gone wrong is the cold fusion debacle of 1985.
Fusion reactions occur when 2 hydrogen atoms become so hot that they fuse together, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. Because current technology demands that more energy has to be put into a reaction than comes out, it hasn't been economically viable. However, Stanley Pons of the University of Utah and Martin Fleischmann of the University of Southampton claimed that they could create a fusion reaction at room temperature and make fusion energy a reality with the potential of making uncounted billions of energy dollars. Oh, and by the way, they stopped by Congress and wanted $25 million for additional research.
Normally, researchers verify their scientific findings by following the accepted conventions of science.
Modern science has unfortunately evolved into a huge feedback loop. Without grants, scientists can't conduct research. Without research, scientists can't publish papers. Without published papers, scientists can't achieve recognition or bring future dollars to secure their future. So the cliche "publish or perish" has a great deal of meaning, both literally and figuratively. In addition, while almost every university administrator would say on camera that there is no publish or perish quota system in effect to judge the status of a given professor, they would all be at a complete loss to give the name of any high-ranking professor who did not publish at least 3 or 4 papers a year.
Accomplishment is generally evaluated on multiple levels. One is the number of publications, but more importantly to that, the quality of publications.
A publication is important for scientists and researchers for a number of reasons. One is because it does get the claims before their own community. It ensures review. It ensures that it has gone through some process within the community that assesses the credibility of what is being said.
Some of the government agencies, for example, the National Institutes of Health, weigh their evaluation criteria very heavily on whether or not you've published and whether or not the journals that you've published in are peer-reviewed journals.
One goes from assistant professorship to associate professorship, and depending, the rate of that promotion is generally dependent on the person's rate of accomplishments. So the more you accomplish, the more grants you generate, the more articles you publish, the faster your rate of ascent.
This alleged life and death need to publish is especially significant for university research professors. In addition to their struggle to procure grant money, publishing is important in order to capture the elusive pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the ultimate ride on the university gravy train, that guarantee of lifetime employment known as tenure.
The philosophical reason for tenure is that it gives people freedom of speech, so that you can say something that someone else doesn't like, a different, not personal, but a different theory, and you're protected. And you need that in an academic environment, otherwise there's no controversy. If you're afraid to speak out because you're going to be fired, then people would not have the same freedom of thought.
As it has evolved in the latter part of the 20th century, it is a reward system for truly outstanding accomplishment in science, and depending on the university, also interwoven with accomplishments as a teacher and as a clinician. And it is, again, depending on the university, given to no more than 10% to 25% of individuals on a faculty.
If scientists fail to maintain the highest levels of publishing, they not only risk losing their funding, but their status in the university as well. Furthermore, the loss of grants directly threatens earnings, since many professors receive the bulk of their salary from soft money or research grants. Critics allege that when scientists themselves must chase the money needed to support their labs and university status, that biased research results, especially those linked to powerful vested interests, are permitted and even expected.
There are close and tight collaborations between many of the companies, Pfizer especially, and the research institutes, the college campuses. Very difficult in many cases to distinguish when you're on campus and when you're in the corporate setting.
But there is that fear. In fact, it probably might even be even a little bit exaggerated, that fear. There are institutional review boards that go over every protocol. If you go and publish a paper and you do it for a company, in that paper it has to say that this research was funded by that company. If you give a talk about something, you have to say that some of the facts that I'm going to present here were part of a study that was supported by X company. So there is that area of conflict of interest.
The major interaction between the pharmaceutical industry and academia is through various clinical trials. And that's a very, very important interaction. That is where the pharmaceutical firms finally recognize whether they have a good product or not. They have enough preliminary data, but they need to have it corroborated in a clinical setting. And quite frankly, it's not biased. And drugs will either then drop out of the clinical marketplace, or if they're good drugs, their development will then go on to the FDA. But at every step of the way, the product is evaluated.
Actually, the commercial community is interested. They're not interested in having somebody be corrupt and ruin the name of their product because they tried to please them and did something that was out of the ordinary. So this science undergoes more scrutiny than anything else. It's kind of like your income tax. There's probably about 5% of people that are crooks that don't even file their income tax. And then there's the rest of us, 90% of people. We do a good job because we know, you do an honest job because you know that the possibility is that you could be audited, and that people are watching you. People pick on that 5% because they like to read about it. Who was the press going to write about it? Mr. Jones? Oh, we interviewed Mr. Jones today, and he had a perfect tax report. How nice. Or this bum hasn't filed in 5 years, and we have bad schools because he's not paying his taxes. I mean, it's the same thing. Of course, I like bad news myself to read about it.
Well, I think the American public is pretty intelligent. I think they recognize that wide use of medications frequently is associated with unexpected complications. I think that consciously or subconsciously, when they hear about drugs that cause certain side effects and certain medical problems, they recognize that something unfortunate has occurred, and they're concerned about it. But at the same time, I think they recognize that the system is working for the betterment of themselves, and that the primary goal of our system is to do no harm.
Part of thinking about that is that science isn't perfect either. We do experiments, we think we understand what's going on, we publish it, we think we know one answer at least, and 3 years, 4 years down the road, the methods change, the technology has advanced, and the results change. The results don't change, but how we interpret them may change as time progresses.
The example of discovering the problems that emerge with fen-phen with greater use are typical of what happens in our system. Any pharmaceutical, once it goes beyond the clinical testing that it's subjected to, is frequently found to behave differently once it goes into a broader population base.
Public confidence is eroded by these odd cases. But on the other hand, what happens the next day when someone comes out with an antibody that attacks breast cancer? Then public opinion rises again. I mean, it's okay.
So a product comes to the market generally after being tested in anywhere from several thousand to perhaps 10,000 individuals. When the product comes on the market, be it fen-phen or any other pharmaceutical, we then have a population base of 100,000 or 500,000 or millions of people. Then one begins to see side effects that one did not anticipate. Or the drug may even behave better than one anticipated.
Viagra, I think, would be a good example of where originally the project wasn't aimed at the treatment for erectile dysfunction. It was aimed at some other kind of a treatment, and as we went through the discovery and the development process, we discovered that that was not going to be an avenue that made sense. There might have been 4 or 5 applications considered, but in the end, the one that looked like the most viable from a scientific, probably from a financial side, from an acceptance by society, would have been to aim the treatments toward erectile dysfunction.
Today, while tolerance of even a small amount of fudging, misrepresentation, or of seemingly insignificant leaps of faith can prove deadly to both one's career and ultimately to the consumer that uses the product, in actuality, such conduct is extremely rare. The scientific community is armed with effective checks and balances that serve to preserve the purity of science.
There are occasional bad apples, but virtually all of the scientists are really trying their best, are honest, and are pursuing what they believe are exciting venues of research.
And I think it's up to each scientist that they maintain integrity, that they do the best science they can, and that they present the results as what they actually are.
These are people that are highly educated, highly intelligent, have a great spirit and love for life, for their own and for other people. And even though we are doing experimentation, there are tremendous safeguards built in, again, both internally and externally, to obviate the chance of there being problems.
So there are all these steps built in. You have to get approval by FDA. So there are all these steps that ensure that the products that come to market should be safe and helpful.
And the FDA is not known as being an easy mark for the pharmaceutical industry. They want hard data, and they analyze that data with consultants, and they will not approve a product unless they are certain of its efficacy and of its safety.
Science progresses with sound, reliable results only to the degree that scientists are honest. But as we have seen here, science is in better shape than many people have been led to believe. The checks and balances are working, and the few who do decide to defy the system are, in the end, caught, vanquished, and ultimately banished to academic Siberia.